Some call it tomato, others tomato. No matter what you call it, you should be planting some. It's been known as pomodoro or golden apple by the Italians, and as pomme d'amour, love apple by the French, who purported it to have aphrodisiac qualities. Some Englishmen thought it to be toxic, but by the 1780s, tomato sauce was widely used in England. Who could resist? It's a rampant vine that at first was planted as an ornamental in English gardens, but which was later banished to the backyard, deemed too ugly and weed-like. It is now making a strong comeback, being one of the first plants beginning gardeners choose, since homegrown tomatoes are far superior in taste than store-bought. I'm Siloe Oliveira, a gardener and self-described tomato aficionado. In this episode, you will see the way I plant tomatoes from start to finish, and maybe pick up a few tricks and tips for you to start growing them too. It's tomato season in this suburban homestead. Summer is the height of tomato season. Tomato is an easy crop to grow, except when it isn't. It depends a lot on your climate, and if you've ever battled some persistent tomato diseases, you know what I mean. Previously, I've shown you how I set up an experimental hugelkultur bed in my backyard. I did plant tomatoes in it, and they have been growing, but in this episode, I want to share you how I normally plant tomatoes in simple garden beds. Actually, in my front yard. I start the seeds indoors under fluorescent lights in February and harden them off in April in the same way I have shown previously. I prepare garden beds that are 3 to 4 feet wide and amend them with compost and a bit of well-rotted manure, but don't overdo it. You don't want your tomatoes growing huge leaves and no tomatoes. I also add organic fertilizer that is higher in phosphorus and potassium. I do not recommend using chemical fertilizers. Although they may boost production temporarily, they kill some microbes in the soil which would be naturally fixing nutrients for your plants, thus making your plants dependent on the chemical fertilizers. I work the earth up with a strong garden fork. I feel a fork does a better job at aerating the soil without causing the hardpan compaction that rototillers and shovels can, and without harming earthworms and other critters that are essential to soil health. I lay the tomato plants out in a diagonal pattern. By planting in a diagonal pattern, you're using geometry to your advantage. Humans are used to square grids. Think city plans, desks in a classroom, graph paper, even Tetris. It may be easy to understand, but it may not be the most efficient use of space. In an area of 10 feet by 4 feet, I can fit as much as 30% more tomatoes in a diagonal pattern versus a square arrangement. This way, I'm able to fit more tomato plants and thus more tomato varieties in a smaller space. I know the spacing I use for tomatoes would be considered too close, since it is advisable to plant them 3 feet apart. Here's a tip for the first-time gardener. Stick to the 3 feet apart guideline for planting tomatoes. This will help you manage it, as well as prevent some really pesky fungal diseases that can plague tomatoes. Once you've gained experience and confidence, then you can start experimenting with closer distances. I proceed planting them gently but firmly. Here's another tip. If you raise tomato seedlings in a windowsill and they grow tall and lanky, don't give up. Tomatoes are forgiving. You can bury most of the stem underground when planting, and it will grow out roots, causing the plant to grow strong. Your tomatoes will start growing fast. That is, considering you planted in the right spot and at the right time. Tomatoes should only be planted outdoors after the soil has warmed up and all danger of frost is gone. Here in Maryland, it ends up being around May 15th. Only plant tomatoes in a sunny spot. You need a bare minimum of 6 hours of sun for your tomatoes to grow and produce. Planting in the shade and partial shade, in my experience, is setting yourself up for failure. But if you only have partial shade available, plant cherry tomatoes instead of large tomatoes, as they should produce at least something. Inevitably, you will need to trellis tomatoes. Tomatoes come in 2 different types, the determinate tomatoes and the indeterminate tomatoes. What it actually means is that the determinate tomatoes, they will grow to a set height and produce a set number of fruit, and then they will stop. Whereas an indeterminate tomato keeps growing and producing as long as conditions are good. Because of this growth habit, they especially need a good structure to secure them. Store-bought tomato cages don't do the job in my opinion, so I've experimented with different alternatives. Here's one of those alternatives. If you want a more formal structure, reminiscent of French gardens, that is durable and should last for several seasons to come, a Tudor. All you need is a few deck spindles, some pressure treated wood, screws, some woodworking skills, and you too can build your own for about $15 to $20. A bargain considering some tutors sell for upwards of $100. I will show you a step-by-step how-to on building one of these tutors in a future episode. I've recycled stairway spindles and made these tutors that I've painted white. They have lasted for 5 years already, although I had to mend them here and there since this wood is not pressure treated and starts to rot once you put your tutor over your tomato plant. Then you can use twine or strips of an old cotton t-shirt to tie the vines to the support. Placing wire mesh on top of the middle stage of the tutor can help support the plant. Raising your tomatoes out of the ground is essential to prevent soil-borne fungus disease. It will also help prevent fruit from touching the ground and rotting. It is important to keep soil mulched to prevent soil splashing onto leaves and carrying fungus spores, as well as to provide adequate moisture and fertility to tomato roots. If you follow these tips and have your tomatoes on a sunny spot providing adequate watering, they will grow in no time during hot season and produce in abundance. But there are many tips out there that promise to help your tomatoes yield more, including pruning and pinching side growth. I personally don't have much time to do that, and I just let them grow naturally, save the odd supporting here and there. But it can be a great idea to experiment with those techniques and see what works for you. Tomatoes can yield a glut of fruit at a time, or they can be fussy and disease-prone depending on your climate. But if you harvest bushels of them, or just a single one, as soon as you take a bite of a tomato you have grown yourself and picked it ripe out of the vine, you will come to the conclusion that life is good. We have a question from a viewer. It's from Peaches from Lovers for a Healthy Life channel. And she writes, I'm a little impatient when it comes to compost. It's like I'll throw stuff on the pile and in a few weeks wonder why it's not rich soil already. Just wondering, what's the normal time to receive rich compost soil? She did send us some pictures, and it shows that her piles are located in woods, and she says it doesn't get much sun. She also says that mainly she puts in grass clippings. Well, Peaches, I think from what you've described, you might need a bit more patience. I think your pile could take from anywhere from 6 months to a year, especially if you don't turn it, and depending on the ratio that you have of carbon to nitrogen. You want to make sure that it doesn't really smell too bad, because that means it's going anaerobic. So you can always turn it and help with that or add a bit of carbon material. Thanks for sending in your question. And if you're watching and you want to send me a question for me to try to answer, remember, send it to seedofchoice@gmail.com and I'll do my best to answer it. Thanks for watching, thanks for liking, thanks for subscribing. Join me next time when I share with you what I do with extra tomatoes. And don't forget to subscribe to Suburban Homestead.